Widowed farmer sees pregnant woman trying to push a broken wagon in the rain. Comment telling me what you thought of this story, giving a score from 0 to 10, and comment what city you are watching me from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The gale hit before the rain did. Out here on the West Texas plains, when the north wind kicks up that blinding red dust that chokes your lungs, the old-timers say it's a sign that something wicked is heading your way. I knew that sign well, having learned it from my father, who learned it from his. And on that Tuesday afternoon, as I was riding my horse back from the county livestock auction, my saddlebags smelling of feed corn and damp earth, I saw something on that red dirt road that made me pull the reins so hard my horse nearly reared up. A woman, pregnant, pushing a wooden handcart all by herself, dead against the howling wind. Her swollen belly barely fit between her stretched out arms, and her dark hair was plastered to her face by a thick mix of sweat and dust. Her bare feet were sinking into the gathering mud, but she wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, and she wasn't asking for help. And that was exactly what sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. I sat frozen in the saddle for 2 whole minutes, just watching her with a sinking feeling, noticing something in her eyes, a terrified determination, like someone running for their life without knowing if they'd make it. I turned my horse around, fully intending to ride away because I had learned the hard way that minding other people's business comes with a heavy price tag. But my conscience wouldn't let me leave her. Her face flashed in my mind like a lightning strike, and I turned my horse right back around. When I pulled up next to the cart, the woman didn't thank me, but instead stepped in front of the wagon, as if to shield it with her own body, stammering with a trembling voice that she didn't need any help, her fear betraying every word. That's when I noticed what I had missed before. The cart was locked from the outside with a heavy, rusted padlock. And there was a noise coming from inside, a small, warm, living sound. My name is Matthew, just like the apostle, because my mother was a devout woman who believed a biblical name offered protection, though what truly protected me was my silence. I was a man of few words, with calloused hands and a stare that carried more weight than any speech. Having lost my wife 2 years prior in a sudden passing that left the ranch feeling entirely too big, and my heart completely hollowed out. Since then, I avoided other people's troubles with the same stubbornness I used to bury my own grief deep down where nobody could see it. I dismounted slowly, making no sudden moves, and approached the woman, asking if there was a child in there while pointing at the wagon. She hesitated, but finally gave a stiff nod, whispering that her daughter was inside, sleeping. Right at that second, the sky broke open, not with a gentle drizzle, but with one of those violent Texas downpours that turns a dirt road into a river of mud in the blink of an eye. The woman looked up at the sky with a look of pure despair that shattered something deep inside my chest. I told her to come with me, and it wasn't a request. It was just the only right thing left to do. Her name was Emily, 32 years old, 7 months along, carrying a history folded up in her chest like a letter she could never read out loud. I didn't know any of that right then. I only knew she agreed to come to the ranch because the storm turned vicious and the wind snapped a heavy oak tree right across the road, leaving her no other choice. I carefully snapped the old padlock open, and inside, wrapped in a patchwork quilt, was a 4-year-old girl named Emma, sleeping soundly as if the world wasn't falling apart around her. There was also a duffel bag stuffed with some clothes, legal documents, and a Bible with someone else's name embossed on the cover, a name I instantly recognized: Clayton. That was the first time this whole story flipped on its head, because Clayton was the owner of the massive ranch bordering mine, a wealthy, widely respected man who never missed a Sunday service or the annual county charity galas. He had the kind of prestige you buy with hefty church donations and the right family tree. But he also harbored a twisted, inherited belief that certain sufferings were necessary to purify those who strayed from his idea of the right path. I looked at Emily, soaked to the bone and shivering violently as she clutched her daughter, and it finally clicked. She wasn't just running away from a bad situation, she was fleeing a monster who could destroy her completely. I hoisted the little girl onto the back of my saddle, wrapped my heavy leather coat around Emily, and we trudged toward my ranch through the blinding tempest. The ride was short, but felt like an eternity, the rain lashing at us, while the wind howled like a wounded coyote, and Emily didn't utter a single syllable the entire way, just holding her child in a death grip and constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting a ghost to step out of the rain. When we finally arrived, my housekeeper Martha, a silver-haired woman in her 60s who had a gift for knowing exactly what a person needed before they even spoke, was already standing on the porch with a lantern. She took one look at Emily and the soaked child and didn't ask a single question, just unlocked the guest cabin and immediately started brewing hot tea and fetching clean wool blankets. Out here in the country, that's just how we do things. You offer shelter first and maybe ask questions later, or sometimes you never ask at all. But I needed to know, and though I didn't press her with words, I asked by quietly fixing the corral fence right outside her window and bringing over hot stew without making a fuss, until Emily slowly started piecing her story together for me. Like mending a torn shirt, one stitch at a time. She had been a maid at Clayton's estate, and the horrors of what went on behind those closed doors were recorded only in the bruises on her skin and the crumpled papers shoved in her bag. She had bolted in the dead of night with her little girl, having no destination in mind other than getting as far away as possible. However, the news that she was hiding out at my place reached Clayton much faster than I anticipated, because out in these rural parts, every secret grows wings. When I realized she was running from Clayton, a different kind of chill washed over me, a freezing wave of recognition. Because years ago, Clayton was the indirect cause of the crushing financial stress and land disputes that ultimately broke my late wife's fragile heart. I could never prove his underhanded tactics in court, forcing me to swallow my dry screams of rage every single day of my 2 years as a widower. That was the second time the story turned, and this time the knife twisted deep. I made up my mind right then and there that Emily wasn't leaving my property until she was safe. Though safe is a mighty complicated concept around here, seeing as Clayton's neighbors were all in his pocket, the county sheriff had just eaten dinner at his sprawling estate 3 times last month, and the local district attorney was the mayor's own nephew. Justice had the wrong zip code in our county, and the very next morning, the first roadblock hit when 2 of Clayton's hired hands intercepted me on the trail, inviting me to have a little chat. Their message was crystal clear. Emily needed to return to fulfill her contractual obligations, and I was sticking my nose where it didn't belong. A threat delivered by a burly foreman named Clint, who was known for never having to repeat a warning. I slid off my horse, stared a hole straight through the both of them, and flat out lied, telling them she was already gone. That calculated lie bought us exactly 3 days of breathing room. Martha, carrying the deep wisdom of a lifetime spent navigating country politics, brought me a tin cup of black coffee on the morning of the 3rd day while I was digging post holes, suggesting a plan that sounded like sheer madness. We needed to take Emily into town for the big annual County Bluegrass Jamboree, about 4 miles down the road. She stated with a tone that left zero room for argument that nobody dares lay a hand on anyone in the middle of a crowded festival, knowing full well that the Jamboree was a sacred 3-day tradition of parades, fiddle music, and family gatherings, and Clayton wouldn't risk causing a public scene when he had a pristine reputation to uphold. I weighed the heavy risks against our lack of options and finally nodded my agreement. The next day, we rode out, Me on my horse with little Emma riding behind the saddle, and Emily on a gentle mare Martha had saddled up. Emma was humming happily, thrilled to be outdoors after days of hiding, while Emily kept a bandana pulled high over her face, her anxious eyes scanning the tree line. The town square was decked out with bright crepe paper banners, string lights zigzagging between the wooden telegraph poles, and the air was thick with the smell of funnel cakes and smoked brisket. Folks were giving each other long, hearty hugs. Kids were darting between the craft booths, and the lively strumming of banjos echoed off the brick buildings. It was a beautiful, vibrant scene, and for just a fleeting moment, Emily's shoulders actually dropped as she relaxed. It was right there, sitting on a wooden park bench while a country band played on the gazebo, that I bumped into Daniel, a sharp 30-something lawyer who had moved to the city but was back visiting his folks for the weekend. We started swapping small talk about the lingering drought and the poor corn harvest, and before I even knew what I was doing, I found myself spilling the entire terrifying truth about Emily. Daniel listened intently, never interrupting or casting judgment, and when I finished, he stared at a passing parade float for a long minute before telling me that he had handled a similar labor abuse case before and that there was a legal way out, provided we had hard documentary evidence. The wrinkled papers inside Emily's duffel bag could be the exact silver bullet we needed. But before we could even start plotting our next move, the third massive twist hit us head on. Clayton himself strolled right into the festival. He was wearing a $1 million smile, shaking hands, kissing babies, and loudly promising to fund the new roof for the community church. He clapped the reverend on the back, posed for the local newspaper photographer with the Sunday school choir, and waved at the old-timers tuning their guitars. And then his eyes locked onto me, and he stopped dead in his tracks. His perfectly rehearsed smile never dropped, but his eyes turned as cold as a frozen lake as he sauntered over, extending his hand like we were the best of friends, noting that it had been far too long. I gripped his hand tight without uttering a single syllable, while he leaned in close and whispered through his grinning teeth that I had kids to worry about, correcting himself to say I didn't, but reminding me I had a beautiful ranch, and ranches had deeds that could easily be disputed. The threat was laid bare. We packed up and headed back to the ranch that very night, Emily sensing the grim shift in my demeanor and staying dead silent the whole ride back. Once we were safely indoors, I asked to see the documents she had stashed in her bag, and though she hesitated, she finally handed them over. They were a damning collection of illegal employment contracts packed with abusive clauses, heavily docked pay stubs, handwritten ledgers with dates and names, and, most importantly, an old letter Clayton had written years ago, detailing his brutal disciplinary methods for keeping his workers in line. It was more than enough to trigger a massive investigation, and though it might not guarantee a conviction on its own, it was a solid start. I locked the papers in my floor safe and went to bed with the crushing feeling that a clock was ticking down fast. When I woke up the next morning at dawn, two of my most reliable ranch hands, Ray and Tom, were waiting in the kitchen with their hats in their hands, staring at their boots as they mumbled that they had to quit because they got a much better offer. They didn't have to say who the offer was from. I already knew it was gone in an instant. A blatant economic strangulation disguised as a crazy coincidence. Martha just shook her head as she flipped pancakes on the cast-iron stove, warning me that Clayton was going to keep tightening the noose until I suffocated and let Emily go. She was dead right. Clayton was a bulldog who never let go, and every passing hour Emily stayed on my land made the crosshairs on my back grow larger. Then, out of nowhere, Daniel showed up that blazing hot afternoon, his beat-up sedan kicking up a cloud of dust as he rattled up my driveway. He had spent all night reviewing the photos of the documents I had snapped with Martha's smartphone, enthusiastically slapping a manila folder on the table and declaring we had a fantastic case, but that he absolutely needed the physical originals, because grainy cell phone pictures wouldn't hold up in front of a judge. My stomach plummeted straight through the floorboards. The originals were supposed to be in Emily's bag. We rushed over to the guest cabin where Emily was gently rocking Emma to sleep, and when I asked for the documents, all the blood drained from her face. Her voice cracked as she choked out that they were gone, explaining she had shoved the bag under her bed the night before, but when she woke up, it was missing. The room started spinning as Daniel closed his eyes and let out a long, defeated sigh, knowing that without the hard evidence, his hands were completely tied, and Clayton damn well knew it too. Emily broke down, not a loud wail, but a quiet, suffocated sobbing of a woman who had simply run out of tears and willpower. Little Emma woke up and started crying too, completely terrified and confused, prompting Martha to rush in, scoop the toddler up, and whisk her away so we could think. Daniel desperately asked if there was absolutely anything else we could use as leverage. Emily wiped her red eyes, thought for a hard second, and then marched over to an old, moth-eaten coat hanging on a rusty nail, reaching deep into the torn lining to pull out an ancient, cracked smartphone. She confessed she had meticulously photographed every single page before she ever ran away, terrified she might lose the physical copies crossing the county lines. The digital photos were all there, a bit blurry, but completely readable. It wasn't the smoking gun Daniel wanted, but it was a lifeline. He grabbed the phone, zoomed in on the images, and nodded slowly, telling us he needed a few days to work his legal magic, but warned me I had to hold the fort down tight, because if Clayton caught wind that we had digital backups, he would launch an all-out war. The words all-out war kept bouncing around my skull long after Daniel drove off. Later that evening, Tara, the young girl who helped Martha wash dishes, pulled me aside into the dark pantry, nervously wringing her apron as she whispered that she had seen Ray sneaking out of the guest cabin the previous afternoon, but was too scared to snitch. Ray, one of the men who had mysteriously quit that morning, a man I had trusted with my livelihood. The fourth massive shockwave hit us the next morning from the absolute last direction I ever expected. A woman marched right up to my front gate. She looked to be in her early 40s, wearing a faded denim jacket and sporting a look of profound exhaustion, introducing herself as Jackie, Clayton's estranged younger sister. She stood firmly at the property line, refusing to step foot inside, stating she had taken a bus from 3 towns over because she heard the rumors and needed to speak directly to the woman hiding on my ranch. I just stared at her, utterly baffled, until she let out a heavy sigh and explained that her brother was a monster hiding behind a gentleman's mask, and that she had cut ties with her toxic family years ago. But if he was repeating his old sins, she possessed the one thing that could finally nail his coffin shut. I quickly brought Emily out to the porch, and the two women locked eyes in a heavy, loaded silence before Jackie dropped a bomb that changed the entire trajectory of our lives, telling Emily that she wasn't the first one on the edge of the mattress with Emma clinging to her side. Martha brought in a tray of fresh coffee and butter cookies, but the tension was so thick nobody dared to take a bite. Jackie's voice was steady but dripping with a decade of repressed sorrow, as she explained she had hoarded a stash of old letters, personal correspondence her brother had written to her over the years, where he bragged about his twisted methods, proving he had a psychotic, systematic pattern of abusing his vulnerable staff. Emily's knuckles turned bone white as she gripped her knees, asking with a trembling voice why Jackie had kept them for so long. Jackie looked her dead in the eye and said she always knew a day of reckoning would come, a day when someone brave enough would finally stand up to him, and she wanted to be armed and ready. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a thick yellowed envelope bound in twine, spilling out dozens of letters, manic scribbles, and ledgers dating back more than 15 years. She read one aloud, a chillingly sterile set of instructions on how to physically correct the improper behavior of his female farmhands, dressing up his sadism in the language of moral righteousness. I felt physically sick to my stomach. I knew Daniel had to see this immediately. I called him up, and within 30 minutes, his car came sliding into my gravel driveway. He spread the letters across the kitchen table, reading every single word, furiously scribbling notes on his legal pad, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were blazing as he declared that these letters, combined with Emily's digital photos, gave us an airtight federal-level case. But our triumph was incredibly short-lived, because just as Daniel was organizing the files, Emily collapsed on the porch, clutching her swollen belly and letting out a ragged groan. Martha dropped her broom and screamed my name with a sheer panic that made me sprint across the yard. Emily was chalk white, gasping for air, dripping in cold sweat, and sobbing that the pain was tearing her apart. Martha pressed the back of her hand to Emily's forehead, her eyes wide with terror as she announced Emily was burning up with a severe fever and needed to get to the county hospital right that second. The horrific problem was that the hospital was a 40-minute drive on a good day, and the torrential rains had washed out 2 major bridges on the main highway. Daniel threw his car keys on the table, offering to risk the flooded roads, but Martha shot him down, stating fiercely that a horse can wade through mud that would swallow a sedan whole, and that I knew the backcountry trails better than anyone. I sprinted to the barn, saddled up my strongest quarter horse, carefully hoisted Emily up behind me, lashed a thick wool blanket around her, and took off at a dead gallop. I left Martha to care for little Emma, and Daniel stayed behind to guard the golden evidence, while I pushed my horse through the fading, fiery orange dusk of the Texas plains, feeling Emily's dead weight slumping against my back as her breathing grew frighteningly shallow. The back roads were a total nightmare, completely submerged in rushing brown water, forcing me to hack my way through dense, thorny brush just to keep moving forward. My horse was foaming at the mouth and snorting heavily, but he didn't quit, while Emily whimpered in agony, clinging to my leather vest and begging me not to stop. I yelled back over the wind that I wasn't going to stop and to just hold on tight. We finally crashed into the hospital emergency bay just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Emily could barely stand on her own 2 feet. A swarm of nurses dragged her onto a gurney and vanished down a bright white hallway, leaving me stranded in the waiting room, completely caked in freezing mud and horse sweat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I sat on a hard plastic chair for 3 agonizing hours, staring blankly at the linoleum floor, haunted by the memories of failing to save my own wife, terrified I was about to lose Emily and her unborn child the exact same way. When the exhausted doctor finally pushed through the swinging doors, my heart stopped beating entirely, but he offered a tight smile, explaining she had gone into extreme premature labor induced by severe stress and infection, but they had managed to stabilize her. The baby was safe for now, but Emily needed strict bed rest. I took my first real breath in hours. Emily stayed in the ward for 2 days, and I rode back to the ranch to fetch Emma, bringing the little girl to the hospital where she sat by her mother's bedside, gently singing nursery rhymes to keep her spirits up. Meanwhile, Daniel was working like a demon, driving 3 counties over to file the lawsuit with a federal judge who owed absolutely no favors to Clayton's corrupt network, getting every photo and letter officially authenticated and logged into the public record. But Clayton wasn't just sitting around waiting to be arrested. When I returned to my ranch, I found old Joe, my neighbor of 40 years, leaning against my front gate with a grim expression, whispering that the local sheriff had officially tossed out the initial police report after enjoying a private late-night steak dinner with Clayton. I gritted my teeth, tasting blood, knowing exactly what a private dinner meant in this crooked county. Joe squeezed my shoulder, warning me to watch my back because Clayton's reach was long and he was preparing to strike back hard. I knew Joe was right. but we had crossed the point of no return. Daniel called the next morning, buzzing with adrenaline, shouting that the federal court had accepted the massive lawsuit, but that Clayton was about to be officially served with the papers. And when that happened, all hell would break loose. Hell arrived the very next morning. I rode out to check the north pasture and found the barbed wire fence cleanly snipped, and 3 of my absolute best prize heifers were gone, their heavy hoofprints leading straight onto an abandoned, foreclosed plot of land Clayton had secretly bought up months ago. I tracked the prints and found my cows locked in a makeshift pen, completely unguarded, sending a deafeningly loud message. Clayton could breach my property anytime he wanted, take whatever he pleased, and the local law wouldn't lift a finger to stop him. I drove my cattle back home, the menacing threat echoing in my mind. Emily was discharged that same afternoon, looking like a ghost but fiercely alive, and Emma refused to let go of her mother's hand. Martha had a pot of hearty chicken and dumplings bubbling on the stove, and fresh sheets on the bed, while Jackie, who had stayed behind to help, vowed she wasn't leaving until she saw her brother in handcuffs. That night, I sat on the porch with Daniel, who was nervously puffing on a rare cigarette, staring up at the sprawling Texas stars, predicting that Clayton would hire the most ruthless corporate lawyers in Dallas to drown us in injunctions. I asked him what would happen if our evidence wasn't enough to slay the dragon, and Daniel took a long, slow drag before exhaling the smoke and whispering that it simply had to be. The 5th and final twist hit us 3 days later, like a runaway freight train. At 3 in the morning, the ranch was dead quiet until Emily shattered the silence with a blood-curdling scream of pure agony. Her water had broken, and the baby was coming right now. Martha scrambled to light the kerosene lamps. Jackie shielded a terrified Emma, and I sprinted to saddle the horse once again. But this time, a massive, lightning-struck pine tree had crashed directly across my main access road, creating an impenetrable wall of splintered wood and tangled branches. There was absolutely no way around it. The dense, thorny underbrush was too thick for a horse carrying a woman in active, screaming labor. Emily collapsed into Martha's arms, her face drenched in sweat, completely giving up hope. Suddenly, Daniel appeared in the rain with a flashlight, shouting that we could take the old, abandoned smuggler's trail that snaked along the flooding creek. It was miles out of the way, but it was our only shot. I knew that treacherous trail. It was a narrow, rocky death trap even in broad daylight, but I hauled myself into the saddle. Daniel practically shoved Emily up behind me, and Martha strapped a heavy leather belt around the both of us to keep Emily from falling off, locking eyes with me and commanding me to ride like the devil himself was on my tail. We plunged into the pitch-black woods, guided only by the faint silvery moonlight piercing the storm clouds, my horse carefully navigating the slippery shale drops. Emily squeezed my ribs so hard I thought they would crack, sobbing through every violent contraction. I hollered back over the roaring wind for her to hold on just a little longer, though I knew we were still miles away. The creek had swelled into a raging torrent, the icy water churning around my horse's knees as we plunged across the ford, and Emily let out a shriek so loud I thought I had lost her to the current. I screamed at her not to let go, and she didn't. We finally burst out of the tree line and reached the hospital just as the dawn broke over the plains, Emily's body violently convulsing as the nurses ripped her off the saddle and sprinted her straight into the delivery room. I collapsed onto that same hard plastic waiting room chair, soaked in freezing mud, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Exactly 1 hour later, a sharp, incredibly loud, furious wail echoed down the hallway. A completely exhausted nurse pushed through the doors with a tearful smile, announcing that a tiny, perfectly healthy baby girl had been born, and that Emily had survived the ordeal. I slumped against the painted cinderblock wall, shut my eyes, and only realized I was crying when the hot tears mixed with the cold rain on my cheeks. I rode back to my ranch as the morning sun hit the plains. leaving Daniel at the hospital to stand guard. Martha was waiting in the kitchen with a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon, taking one look at my face and asking if we made it. I choked out that we made it and that it was a little girl. Martha beamed a brilliant smile and whispered a prayer of thanks, while Jackie rocked a sleepy Emma on the porch swing, and I gently told the little girl that her brave mother was okay and she was officially a big sister. I crashed into bed for a few hours, only to be jolted awake by the crunch of Daniel's tires on the gravel driveway. He burst into the kitchen looking completely shell-shocked, announcing that the federal marshals had gone to serve Clayton the indictment that morning, but the massive estate was locked tight, the gates chained, and all the servants dismissed without their final paychecks. I stared at him in disbelief, and he solemnly explained that Clayton had packed a single suitcase and vanished into the wind, knowing his sister's letters had doomed him. Cowards like him never stick around to face the music, they just scurry into the dark. And that was the absolute truth. Clayton was never seen in our county again. His sprawling empire foreclosed by the banks. His unpaid workers compensated by the federal courts, using his seized assets, and his once revered name becoming a permanent town curse. The old men at the barbershop muttered that wicked men run because the demons waiting for them are far worse than any judge's gavel. Emily recovered at the ranch for 2 more weeks, getting stronger every day while her incredibly loud newborn thrived, and little Emma never left her baby sister's side, fiercely protecting her like a tiny guardian angel. Using the recovered documents, Daniel successfully proved that Clayton had fraudulently stolen a beautiful piece of fertile riverfront property that rightfully belonged to Emily's late grandmother, and a federal judge swiftly returned the deed to her name. On the morning Emily was finally ready to move into her own home, Martha threw a massive, celebratory southern breakfast with buttermilk biscuits, thick sausage gravy, and sweet peach tea. We all sat around my massive oak dining table, me, Martha, Daniel, Joe, Tara, and Jackie, eating in a thick, comfortable silence, the kind of heavy, peaceful silence that lets you know the storm is finally over. Emily bounced the baby on her knee, grabbed Emma's hand, and looked across the table at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears, whispering that she had no idea how to ever repay my kindness. I replied softly that she didn't owe me a thing, and to just keep her door unlocked for visitors. She flashed a radiant smile and told me I knew the way. I helped her load her belongings into a newly repaired wagon that Daniel had fixed up, secured the ropes, and gave her gentle mare a pat on the flank, telling her to travel safe. And off she went, driving her own path. Now, every single Friday afternoon, I saddle up my horse and take a slow ride down to Emily's new property, always bringing a little something, a sack of flour, a flat of tomato seedlings, or a new shovel. I never stay too long because I don't need to. Just being there is enough to say everything that needs saying. Emma always waits for me by the wooden gate, jumping up and down and waving frantically, while the new baby grows bigger and more curious by the day. Emily planted a huge vegetable garden, painted the old farmhouse a bright, cheerful yellow, and slowly but surely brought life back to her family's soil. Jackie ended up buying a small cottage in town, getting a job at the local elementary school teaching first grade, and occasionally drops by my ranch for coffee, totally at peace with her brother's disappearance. Daniel headed back to his big city law firm, but calls me every other week, always reminding me that if I ever need a favor, he's just a phone call away, and I know he means it. My ranch eventually returned to its steady rhythm. I hired a crew of good, honest workers, patched up the cut wire fences, and bought back the cattle I lost. The daily grind of waking before dawn, working the soil, and falling into bed exhausted returned. But something fundamental inside me had shifted forever. Every single time I ride my horse past that exact spot on the muddy red road where I first saw Emily battling the storm, the memories flood back. I remember her sheer, desperate terror, the rusted padlock on the wooden cart,